History remembers the victors. But what happens when victory itself is debated, shrouded in propaganda and the fog of war? What happens when two titans of the ancient world collide, shaking the very foundations of power? This isn't just history, it's a high-stakes Game of Thrones played out with bronze swords and thousands of thundering chariots. We travel back, past the era of Megiddo, to the late 14th and early 13th centuries BC. Egypt, the eternal power of the Nile, rich and seemingly invincible under pharaohs like the great Ramesses II. And rising in the north, across the mountains of Anatolia, the Hittite Empire had a formidable military force, masters of iron and disciplined warfare. Between them lay the prize: the cities and trade routes of Syria and Canaan. A land destined to become a battleground. For decades, tension simmered. Skirmishes flared along the contested borders. Egyptian sources paint the Hittites as the aggressors, pushing south, testing the pharaoh's resolve. By the 5th year of his reign, around 1274 BC, Ramesses II had had enough. He assembled a vast army, perhaps 20,000 strong, the core of Egyptians bolstered by fierce Nubian archers and Libyan mercenaries, divided into 4 large divisions named after the great gods: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set. Their target: the strategic city of Kadesh on the Orontes River, a linchpin of Hittite influence in Syria. Across the land, the Hittite king, Muwatalli II, gathered his own forces. A massive coalition, perhaps numbering 30,000 or more, drawing warriors from across his empire and vassal states, including, some scholars believe, the Dardanians, figures linked to the legendary Trojans of Homeric epic. Their greatest strength lay in their chariots. Close to 3,500, heavier than the Egyptian models, carrying 3 warriors, the driver and 2 fighters, a mobile fortress of archery and spears. Ramesses marched north, confident, perhaps overly so. His army advanced in its separate divisions, communication stretched thin across the miles. Reports reached the pharaoh, seemingly confirmed by captured Bedouin scouts, spies deliberately planted by Muwatalli, that the Hittite army was far to the north, near Aleppo, afraid to face the might of Egypt. Relief, perhaps even arrogance, surged through the Egyptian command. Believing Kadesh undefended, Ramesses pushed ahead rapidly with the lead division, the Amun division, eager to secure the city before the supposedly distant enemy could react. The Ra division followed some distance behind, while Ptah and Set were still miles further south. It was a critical error in judgment, born of deceptive intelligence. As the Amun division set up camp just northwest of Kadesh, unaware of the storm about to break, Muwatalli unleashed his trap. Hidden behind the city, thousands of Hittite chariots surged across the Orontes River ford. They smashed into the flank of the 2nd Egyptian division, the Ra division, still on the march, completely unprepared. Imagine the shock. The disciplined lines shattered. Panic erupted. The Ra division disintegrated, fleeing soldiers scattering towards Ramesses' camp, pursued by the relentless Hittite chariots. The wave of metal and fury crashed into the Amun camp itself. Chaos reigned. Heavily laden Egyptian infantry, surprised and disorganized, were cut down. The Hittite chariots penetrated deep, reaching the pharaoh's personal enclosure. Ramesses II, the living god, was suddenly isolated, surrounded, facing death or capture. Here, the Egyptian accounts, carved onto temple walls, become intensely personal. Ramesses, abandoned by many of his troops, prays to Amun for aid. Then, clad in shining armor, he mounts his chariot, victory in Thebes. With only his personal bodyguard, he charges repeatedly into the swirling mass of Hittite chariots. He describes cutting his way through, scattering the enemy before him, a divine warrior against impossible odds. Perhaps there's truth to his bravery. But reality was likely more complex. The very success of the Hittite charge may have worked against them. Their heavy, 3-man chariots, crowded within the confines of the Egyptian camp, became entangled, losing momentum, unable to maneuver effectively to deliver a final blow. They turned to looting, distracted by the riches of the pharaoh's camp, a fatal echo of the mistake the Egyptians themselves made at Megiddo generations earlier. And then, salvation. Not from the main Egyptian divisions still far behind, but from an unexpected direction. A separate force, the Niran, their exact identity debated, perhaps Canaanite allies, perhaps an elite Egyptian unit arriving via the coast, appeared on the battlefield. They struck the Hittite chariots from another flank, adding to the confusion. Caught between the pharaoh's desperate counter-attacks and the arrival of the Niran, the Hittite charioteers found themselves in peril. Many were driven into the Orontes River, drowning in its currents. The tide seemed to turn, but Muwatalli too watched from Kadesh, his vast infantry reserve still largely uncommitted. Seeing his chariot force in trouble, he sent reinforcements, another 1,000 chariots, perhaps crashing back into the fray. Once again, the battle hung precariously in the balance. The fighting raged, a brutal, swirling melee under the Syrian sun. By evening, Ramesses, aided by the eventual arrival of elements from the Petar division, managed to fight his way clear, regrouping what remained of his shattered forces. The Hittites, though blooded, retreated in good order back towards the safety of Kadesh. They had mauled 2 Egyptian divisions and nearly captured the pharaoh, but failed to annihilate the Egyptian army. Ramesses had survived, claiming a divine rescue and personal victory, but his strategic goal, capturing Kadesh, was utterly lost. The next day, the battle resumed, but neither side could force a decisive outcome. Egyptian inscriptions speak of Ramesses driving the Hittites back, but Muwatalli's infantry, potentially sallying from Kadesh, likely stabilized the Hittite lines. Both armies had suffered grievous losses in men and material, particularly the irreplaceable chariots. Kadesh remained defiant. Muwatalli, perhaps facing logistical issues or unrest elsewhere in his empire, proposed a truce. Ramesses, his army battered and far from home, accepted. He marched his forces back to Egypt, leaving Kadesh and northern Syria firmly in Hittite hands, though he had arguably protected Egypt's sphere of influence further south in Palestine. Back in Egypt, Ramesses proclaimed a magnificent triumph. Temple walls were covered with epic reliefs and texts detailing his personal heroism and the supposed crushing defeat of the Hittites. Kadesh became the defining moment of his reign, spun as an unparalleled victory against overwhelming odds. Yet, the war wasn't truly over. 3 years later, conflict erupted again. Ramesses campaigned repeatedly in Canaan, suppressing revolts among restless vassals, besieging and capturing cities. Egyptian siege craft was brutal and effective. Sappers hacking at mud brick walls and wooden gates with axes, scaling ladders reaching the ramparts under cover of shields and projectile fire from archers and slingers. Cities like Debir and the vital Hittite-controlled fortress of Dapur eventually fell to Egyptian might. But total victory remained elusive. Neither empire could fully dislodge the other from Syria. Finally, some 16 years after the Battle of Kadesh, with a new Hittite king, Hattusili III, on the throne, the two powers chose a different path. In 1259 BC, they signed one of the earliest surviving peace treaties in history, a pact of non-aggression and mutual defense. The borders were formally recognized, dividing Syria. To seal the deal, Ramesses II married a Hittite princess. The great clash of empires ended not with a knockout blow, but with exhaustion and pragmatism. Ramesses, despite his battlefield claims, ultimately secured his power in the Levant through diplomacy, accepting a sphere of influence rather than total conquest. The Battle of Kadesh, eternally depicted as Ramesses' greatest win, was in truth a brutal, near-fatal stalemate that forced a superpower to recognize the limits of its power, forever changing the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Near East. The echoes of those chariot wheels faded, replaced by the cautious words of treaties, a fragile peace built on the memory of near disaster.